The sun was already high over the town of Clay Ridge by the time the livestock auction reached its halfway mark. Dust swirled in the heat like restless ghosts, catching the edges of voices, hooves, and the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel. Cattle bawled in holding pens while men in weather-beaten hats jostled for space, wiping sweat from their brows with kerchiefs that hadn't been washed in weeks. Lee Hanlon stood near the back of the auction yard, his hat pulled low, a hand wrapped tightly around a coin pouch that barely jingled when shaken. Inside were $2 silver, his last real money, and he was there to spend them. Not for a prize bull, not even for meat. He needed hope. Lee was 41 years old, and the land he'd inherited from his father was dying faster than he could save it. The wells were shallow, the windmill broken, and the winter feed had spoiled during the last storm. His mule had died 2 months ago, and with no strong animal to help plow or haul, the coming winter was looking less like a season and more like a sentence. But he hadn't come to town for sympathy. He'd come for something that could pull a harrow, even if it was with a limp. The best bulls were long gone by the time Lee stepped into the bidding crowd. A white-faced Hereford had just sold for $80. A thick-necked Brahmin had gone for $95 to a man in a clean vest and shiny boots. Lee didn't bother looking at them. They weren't what he was there for. He was looking for the last, the lost, and the forgotten. "Next lot," barked the auctioneer. "We've got, this one." A gate creaked open. From behind a rusted fence panel, a thin, beat-up bull limped into the ring. His coat, what was left of it, was patchy and scarred. One of his horns was broken in half. There were sores on his legs and dried blood behind one ear. His ribs stood out like the slats of a broken fence. "Don't get too excited, boys," the auctioneer said with a smirk. "This one came in from the desert 3 days ago. Belonged to a rancher who's gone now, don't ask. Poor creature's barely holding together, but maybe someone's got use for him. We'll start at 10. Anyone?" Silence. A few chuckles. A cough. "Woo?" No hands. "San?" A man in the front muttered. "Not worth the trouble to shoot." Lee looked at the bull. The animal stood with his head low, tail still, not reacting to the laughter, not blinking at the sun. He wasn't wild. He wasn't scared. He just was. And yet, something about him struck Lee like a whisper in the ear, the kind you feel more than hear. He stepped forward and raised his hand. $2. The crowd turned to look. The auctioneer blinked. 2. Well, I suppose that's better than letting him rot in the pen. Sold. To the man in the back with more grit than sense. Laughter rippled, but Lee didn't care. He walked forward, counted out the coins, and took the rope. The bull didn't resist as Lee led him out of the ring, but as they passed the auctioneer, the man said under his breath, "Might have just bought yourself a curse, cowboy." Lee didn't answer. He didn't believe in curses. Just poor decisions. Back at his farm, the world was as quiet as ever. Sagebrush rattled in the dry wind, and the shutters on the old house creaked with the strain of another hot afternoon. Lee led the bull into the paddock, filled the trough with well water, and dumped some old hay into a feed bin. The bull sniffed at the hay but didn't eat. Instead, he turned and stared back at Lee, really stared, like a man measuring another man for a handshake or a duel. "You're not much," Lee muttered, "but neither am I." He stood there for a moment longer, then turned toward the barn to find a blanket and some liniment. Behind him, the bull let out a soft, gravelly sound. Not quite a grunt, not quite a breath, something old. Lee paused. "I guess we'll figure out a name for you later," he said without turning around. But the moment he said it, a word rose in his mind, uninvited and clear. Ash. Like fire that had burned out. Like something left behind after the blaze. Over the next few days, Lee tried everything to help the bull recover. He cleaned his wounds with boiled salt water, slathered them with old ointments. He rubbed his legs with whiskey. He chopped the thistle out of the corral and gave him apples from the one surviving tree near the creek bed. The bull Ash barely reacted. He didn't fight, didn't show pain. He simply watched. And then, one morning, Lee woke to find Ash gone. The gate was still latched. The rope hadn't been touched. But the bull wasn't in the pen. He wasn't behind the barn or near the water trough. Lee checked the house, the dry fields, the edge of the scrubland. Finally, he saw the shape far off in the rising heat, a dark figure walking toward the northern ridge, slow and steady. Lee cursed under his breath, saddled his old quarter horse, and followed. It took nearly an hour to catch up. When he finally reached the top of the ridge, Lee found Ash standing before a circle of half-buried stones, worn smooth by time, some kind of ruin, maybe native, maybe settler. No one had lived up here in decades. Ash was digging at the base of one stone with his hoof. Just like that broken-down horse Ezekiel once followed west of Dead Elk Creek, Lee realized with a chill this animal had not wandered by accident. There was purpose in his stride. And he'd brought Lee here. But why? The only thing Lee found beneath the dust was a brand, carved into the stone, not a letter or a name, a symbol he didn't recognize. But Ash stared at it for a long, long time, then finally turned away and walked back toward home, limping less than he had 2 days before. That night, the sky turned strange. Red clouds, lightning in the far hills. Ash stood facing the north the entire time, unmoving. Lee didn't sleep. He didn't know why, but something was coming. And this bull, this broken, discarded bull no one wanted, might be the only reason he'd survive it. Lee Hanlon never put much faith in superstition. He was a man of calluses and numbers, weather signs and gut feeling. But ever since he followed Ash to that circle of buried stones, his land had gone in quieter. Not peaceful, not quite. More like the kind of quiet that settled in a room just before someone said something they couldn't take back. Ash had returned from the ridge, walking stronger. He still bore the scars and the limp, but there was purpose in the way he moved now, like the weight he carried wasn't just in his body, but in something older. Something he'd carried for years and was only just beginning to lay down. Lee didn't speak of the ruins. He didn't tell anyone about the brand carved into the stone. In truth, he wasn't sure he could. It wasn't a letter. Not from any rancher's alphabet brand he recognized. It was a circle with 4 points, like a compass, but all the points bent inward, twisted, almost like horns. It burned in his mind even now, when he wasn't thinking about it. And Ash had looked at it like it meant something. Over the following week, changes began to show. The land, once brittle and cracked, saw the first signs of green returning. Lee noticed grass sprouting where he hadn't seen green in 2 years near the watering trough, by the edge of the fence line, and most curiously, along Ash's hoof tracks. He told himself it was coincidence. Then the well started running clearer. Water that once stank of rust and algae now came up cold and clean. Lee thought maybe he'd struck a deeper seam, until he checked the pipes and found nothing had changed. Still the same depth. Still the same system. But different water. Ash began walking the perimeter of the land every dawn. Same slow, steady pace. He would stop at the north fence post, turn, and stand for a long time just looking into the horizon like he was remembering something the rest of the world had long forgotten. Lee started following him. Not close, just enough to observe. He noted the way birds never flew over Ash, how dogs wouldn't bark at him, they just sat and watched, how other cattle, even when grazing nearby, gave him a wide berth. Ash never pushed them, never fought. He just walked and let things move around him. By the end of the second week, Lee had to admit the truth. His land was changing, and the only thing that had changed was the bull. One night, during a dry thunderstorm, Lee woke to the sound of low grunting outside. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch. Ash stood in the middle of the yard, motionless, framed by flashes of lightning, facing a man. Not a neighbor, not a friend. This man wore a long, worn coat. His hat was pressed low, and he stood with one hand resting on the hilt of a blade. Not a gun, but a curved knife with a horn handle. He didn't flinch as Lee raised the rifle. "I won't shoot unless I have to," Lee said, voice steady. "You don't own that bull," the man said, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "You just found him." Lee didn't lower the rifle. "Still makes him mine." The stranger smiled barely. "That bull ain't yours, mister. He ain't anyone's. He's older than brands, older than blood. What do you want?" The man took one step closer, not toward Lee, but toward Ash. Ash didn't move. "I just came to see if it's true," the man said. "If he remembers." Lee's finger tightened on the trigger. "Remembers what?" The man's smile turned into something cruel and sad. How the world used to end. Before Lee could reply, a crack of thunder split the night. Not lightning, not sky, something deeper. The wind whipped through the yard, and when it cleared, the stranger was gone. Only his boot prints remained in the dirt. Ash turned and walked back to the barn. Lee didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat by the stove, rifle across his lap, mind turning like an old mill in floodwater. He thought of the brand. He thought of the grass. He thought of the fact that in the 2 weeks since buying Ash, he hadn't felt the usual fear that haunted him every fall, the fear that he wouldn't make it, that winter would take what little he had left. Instead, he felt something else now. Not comfort, not safety, but watchfulness. Like something ancient had settled its eyes on his land, not to harm, not to help, just to see what he would do. The next morning, he rode out to the stone circle. He brought a shovel this time. Ash followed, uninvited, unprompted. When they arrived, Lee dug where the bull had once scraped with his hoof. The soil was soft, like it had been turned once before. 6 inches down, he hit something. Wood, charred. Not from a wildfire, from fire made with intent. He brushed more dirt aside and found bones. Not cattle bones. Human. Skull fragments, a jaw with teeth still intact, and beneath it all, a carved stone knife identical to the one the stranger had worn at his hip. Ash stood at the edge of the pit and let out a sound that Lee would remember until his final breath. Not a grunt, not a bellow, not a growl. A low, vibrating sound that shook the ribs like a drumbeat from underground. The wind stopped. Birds fell silent. And in that stillness, Lee understood. Ash hadn't come from someone's dying ranch. Ash had come back. Back to a place he'd once stood. Back to something unfinished. And Lee, a broken-down cowboy with a failing ranch and a name nobody remembered, had been the one foolish or blessed enough to offer him shelter. That night, Lee took his branding iron, the old LH mark, passed down from his father, and walked to the barn. Ash stood in the shadows, waiting. Lee didn't light the fire. He didn't raise the iron. He dropped it in the dirt. "You don't need a brand," he said. And Ash blinked once slow, heavy like a nod from some ancient being that had seen more winters than stars. Clayridge was never a town that cared for myth. It was a place of freight wagons, cornbread, and pragmatic sin. Folks there didn't believe in ghosts. They believed in drought, taxes, and the price of hay. But word travels like wildfire in dry country. And ever since Lee Hanlon came back from the auction with that broken-down bull and the land around his ranch started greening while the rest of the valley browned, people began to talk. First, it was idle curiosity. Then it became whispers. Then, one Sunday at the feed store, a man named Clive Rollins, who'd once owned the largest herd in the county before rustlers, and a blight took his fortune, said aloud, "You seen Hanlon's pastures lately? Greener than a preacher's lies. I'd say the devil himself struck a deal with that man." No one laughed, because a few of them had seen the bull, and they hadn't liked what they saw. The stories grew. Some said the bull never blinked. Others claimed he drank from the well, but left it fuller than before. One boy, the preacher's son, swore he'd seen it standing in the middle of the dirt road just before a lightning storm, and when he looked again, it was gone. But every fence post along the road had split clean down the center, like something had passed through them, like wind through wheat. Lee ignored the gossip. He had work to do, fences to fix, the barn roof to patch, grain to store for winter. The crops were looking better than they had in 4 years, and the goats were birthing healthy twins. But there were signs he couldn't shake. Ash no longer stayed in the barn at night. Instead, he paced the ridge, walking that same line from the north post to the half-buried stones. Sometimes Lee followed. Sometimes he didn't. One night, Ash didn't return at all. Lee rode out with a lantern and his revolver tucked in his coat. He found the bull near the old dry wash, the one that hadn't run water since Lee was a teenager. The bull stood motionless at the center of the creek bed, head bowed. Lee dismounted. The moment his boots hit the earth, he felt it. A hum, like something far below, pulsing through the stone, not mechanical but alive. And as he stepped closer, he saw it. A horn. Not bone white and cracked like you'd expect, but dark, fossilized, curved backward like a ram's, the size of a wagon wheel jutting up from the ground where erosion had split the creek bed open. Ash turned his head toward Lee, slow and heavy. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. Lee felt it in his spine, a wordless understanding. This horn belonged to something else. Something old. Something Ash had once fought, or followed, or been. Lee knelt by the horn, ran a hand along its surface. It was warm. The next day, Sheriff Tolle came riding up the trail to Lee's ranch. He dismounted slow, friendly but cautious. "Morning, Lee." "Morning, Sheriff." Tolle rubbed the back of his neck. "There's been some folks asking questions. Preacher Harlan, mostly. Says you've brought something unnatural into the county. Wants to hold a vote with the councilman." Lee sipped from his tin cup. "I didn't realize buying a sick bull was a political matter." "It ain't the bull, Lee. It's what he's doing. Or what people think he's doing." Tolle looked toward the corral. Ash stood at the far end, still, watching. Tolle lowered his voice. "Lee, I don't know what's true, but I do know the old men up north used to talk about a creature with a broken horn. Said it wandered the hills long before white men laid fences. Some say it watched battles. Others say it started 'em." Lee said nothing. Tolle glanced around and added, "Just keep things quiet, will you? You've got friends in town. Don't make 'em scared to admit it." Then he rode off. That night, Lee sat beside the fire in silence. Ash lay in the dirt outside the barn, half asleep, one ear twitching at the coyotes in the hills. Lee lit a cigarette with a coal and said, almost to the wind, "Are you what they say you are?" Ash didn't move, but somewhere, deep in the ridge beyond the pasture, something called back, a low howl. Not wolf, not wind. Something else. Lee stood. Ash was already on his feet. The next few days brought storms. Dark ones, thick with iron and dust. The dry creek near the horn split wider, revealing not just bone, but stone carvings, deep underground. Spirals. Horns. Eyes with no pupils. Lee covered what he could, but it wasn't enough, because by the weekend, someone had followed him. Clive Rawlins, armed and twitchy, came up the ridge with 2 hired men and a shotgun in his hands. He shouted across the paddock, "Bring out the bull, Hanlon, the one with the devil in his belly." Lee stood on his porch with the rifle across his arms. "Go home, Clive. You brought a curse on this valley. You brought your own." The 2 men flanking Clive looked less sure now, especially when Ash stepped into view. No snarl, no stomp, just a stare. One man dropped his rifle, turned, ran. Clive raised his shotgun and fired. The shot missed wide, spooked a goat echoed across the whole damn ranch. Lee didn't fire back. He didn't have to, because Ash charged. Not wild, not frantic, but with the weight of stone. Clive fired again, but by the time he pulled the trigger, Ash was already upon him. He didn't gore the man. He didn't trample him. He stopped an inch from his chest, close enough that Clive could see the cracked horn, the pale scar that ringed Ash's left eye, the breath from his wide nostrils. Clive dropped the shotgun, then fainted. Lee never saw him again. A few days later, a note was tacked to the feed store board. "Gone east. Land's cursed. Stay smart." Lee folded it, burned it, and watched the ashes drift into the wind. Ash walked to the ridge again that evening. Lee followed. This time, he wasn't afraid. And as they stood together at the edge of the world, watching lightning bloom across the hills, Lee whispered, "Whatever you are, I'm not sending you away." Ash snorted once, and for a moment, Lee thought he saw something in the dark, moving just beyond the hill. Not cattle, not men, shadows, with horns. Autumn rolled in with red skies and restless wind. The nights grew colder. Frost kissed the fence posts. Coyotes came closer. And every morning, Ash stood at the ridgeline, unmoving, like a sentinel watching the horizon for something older than dawn. Lee Hanlon no longer asked why. He didn't need to, because whatever Ash was, bull, myth, guardian, ghost, he had stayed. And Lee had stayed with him. But the land, it remembered more than it should. One night, a rider arrived. Not from Clay Ridge, not from Tucson. He came without a sound. No dust trail, no hoofbeats just there, in front of the house at dusk. His horse was gray as smoke. His coat hung loose like shadow. His hat dipped low, and from his saddle horn hung a bundle wrapped in leather. Lee stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The rider looked up. His eyes were pale, not white, not blue. Something in between, like sun-bleached bone. "You've been keeping what isn't yours," he said, calm, measured. "It's time to give it back." Lee didn't move. "He came to me. No one else wanted him. He wasn't meant to be wanted. He was meant to be buried." The man dismounted. The bundle clinked when it hit the ground. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a massive, ancient horn, blackened, cracked down the center, and marked with the same spiraled symbols Lee had seen near the dry creek. "I'm the last of the keepers," the man said. "We buried the old ones long ago. Thought we'd sealed them, but the earth cracks. Things walk again." Lee stared at the horn. "You saying Ash is one of them?" "No," the man replied. "He's what was left of them, the part that stayed when everything else turned to fire. A warning, a memory with hooves." Ash stepped into view behind Lee. The man didn't flinch. Neither did Ash. For a long moment, the wind died. The world held its breath. Then the rider spoke again. "You have a choice, Lee Hanlon. Either you let me take him beyond the ridge and seal what was never meant to wake," he nodded to the horn, "or you stand in his place." Lee felt something heavy in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that this wasn't just about one bull. It was about everything we leave behind. Wounds, wars, things we bury and hope don't dig their way back up through the dust. That night, Lee sat beside Ash one last time. He brought no rope, no tools, just an old blanket and a bottle of the whiskey he'd saved for emergencies. "This seems close enough," he muttered. Ash looked at him. Lee poured 2 cups. He left one in the dirt. Didn't care if the bull drank it. They sat together for a long while. Then Lee said, "I think I know now." Ash didn't grunt, didn't blink. But Lee knew the truth just the same. Ash hadn't come looking for shelter. He'd come looking for a witness. Someone to remember, to carry the story forward. Not with glory, but with responsibility. And Lee had been fool enough, or wise enough, to say yes. By morning the rider was gone. The horn was gone. Ash was gone. Lee stood alone at the ridge. But the ground where Ash had walked had bloomed. Small wildflowers, pale blue, delicate, growing in hoofprints that stretched to the horizon. Winter came, hard, as expected. But Lee's well never ran dry. His land held its green longer than the neighbors. And when folks from town passed by, they'd always pause at the edge of the property. Some swore they saw a figure standing by the barn. Others said they heard hooves at night, but no cattle to match them. Lee never confirmed, never denied. He simply stayed. Years passed. The world moved on, faster, louder. The town grew. Trains came. Fences changed. But on the edge of the prairie, an old man kept a stretch of land where the grass grew strange and storms never struck twice in the same place. Children whispered stories of a ghost bull with eyes like coal, and somewhere deep in the dry creek bed, wildflowers still grew year-round. No one knew why, but Lee did. And when he finally passed quiet, alone, with boots at the foot of the bed and his hat resting over his heart, they buried him facing the north, right where the ridge touched the sky. And just before they covered the grave, the undertaker found something strange beside the body. A single blackened horn, cracked, ancient, quiet, still warm.
A tiny puppy fell 90 feet from a bridge. What happened next left everyone speechless. A golden retriever puppy dropped from a 90-foot bridge straight into freezing, raging water. Everyone watching thought it was over. But what came out of that river wasn't just survival. It was something no science could explain. In the weeks that followed, he would sense danger before it arrived, find life where no one else could, and maybe change how we understand the world. Maple Hollow was the kind of town that rarely made the news. Tucked between pine-covered hills in southern Vermont, its seasons arrived like old friends, and its people, mostly teachers, tradesmen, and retired artists, greeted each other by name. On this particular afternoon in late April, the town was awash in the golden hush of early spring. The sun had finally shaken off the last of winter's hold, bathing Cedar Bridge in warm light that glinted off the Willow River below. Emma Lawrence, a 30-year-old art teacher at Maple Hollow Elementary, walked along the wooden planks of the bridge with her new companion trotting at her side. Emma was tall, with a frame both graceful and quietly strong, often dressed in muted earth tones and long cardigans that fluttered in the wind. Her auburn hair, usually pinned into a messy bun, framed a thoughtful face with kind eyes and a faint shadow of tiredness. She had the type of beauty that snuck up on you, subtle, enduring, softened by sorrow. It had been nearly 2 years since a miscarriage shattered her quiet life and left behind silence where laughter once lived. She adopted Bailey not long after. Bailey, a 4-month-old golden retriever with a coat the color of morning sunlight, bounded beside her, His legs were slightly too long for his body, his ears comically floppy, and his tail an unpredictable metronome of joy. He was all paws and enthusiasm, with a gentle soul that seemed far too wise for his age. From the moment Emma saw him at the shelter, he'd locked eyes with her and refused to look away. His paperwork said abandoned on roadside, but the moment she took him home, it was clear. He hadn't been lost. He had been waiting. Cedar Bridge stretched across Willow River, its aged timber structure creaking softly with each passing footstep or bicycle. It was built in the 1870s and survived flood, frost, and time, beloved by tourists and locals alike. Today, a light breeze stirred through the open slats in the sides of the bridge, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The river below shimmered like cold glass. "Easy, Bailey," Emma murmured, tightening her grip on the leash as the puppy pulled toward the far end of the bridge. His nose hovered inches from the wood, tail swishing madly. "It's just a bird." Bailey barked once in protest, and then sat, panting happily, as if to say, "I know. But what if it wasn't?" The late afternoon was calm, save for the occasional cyclist or hiker passing through. One of them, a boy on a bright red bike, sped toward them from the far side. He was no more than 15, with earbuds in and a focused, distracted expression. As he veered to avoid a couple walking hand in hand, his front wheel wobbled and he swerved toward Emma. The motion was sudden, and Bailey startled. He jumped back instinctively. The leash slipped through Emma's fingers, and in a heartbeat his collar, still slightly loose from his last growth spurt, slipped over his head. "Bailey!" The puppy backed away in panic, looking to Emma, then toward the railing behind him. Unaware, his back paws hit the lower beam. The bridge's wooden barrier had been damaged in a storm 2 weeks prior. A jagged gap, wide enough for a small dog, hadn't yet been repaired. It all happened too quickly. Bailey's back legs dropped through the opening. His front paws scrabbled against the wood, claws scraping with a sickening sound. Emma lunged, her fingertips brushing his fur, too late. "No!" He fell. The world tilted. From 90 feet above, the Willow River looked deceptively gentle, but April thaw had turned it into a churning artery of ice and rock, moving fast and merciless. Bailey hit the water. Emma's scream split the air. She ran the length of the bridge, her feet pounding against the wood, heart hammering. Downstream, near a quiet bend in the river where birch trees leaned low over the bank, a man had been photographing mergansers for a wildlife journal. Liam Harper, 34, was a wildlife photographer with a calm, observant presence. He wore a battered olive field jacket, beard flecked with early gray, and his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen both the brutality and the brilliance of the natural world. He had moved to Maple Hollow after his younger brother, a Marine, was lost overseas, choosing solitude and wild birds over grief-stricken conversations. He had just raised his camera when he saw a shape fall from the bridge above. A splash, a cry, a dog. His instincts kicked in. He shoved his camera into his waterproof bag, threw it aside, and shoved his kayak off the shore. Emma, breathless, appeared seconds later on the gravel path beside the river. Her voice cracked as she called Bailey's name. There was no sign of him. The water moved too fast, too cold. The current could have already taken him downstream. Then, a ripple. 30 yards away, a soaked golden head burst above the surface. Bailey flailed, paddling hard, yipping in short bursts. He was alive, and the miracle was only just beginning. The water was colder than Liam expected, bone-deep, spring-fed, and rushing with relentless strength. His arms strained against the paddle as he fought to keep the kayak steady while closing the distance between himself and the struggling puppy. Bailey, still fighting for every breath, was clearly tiring. His young muscles couldn't compete with the current. His golden coat was dark and plastered to his small frame, and his whimpers were drowned beneath the roar of the Willow River. Liam didn't yell. He knew that panic would only make the puppy thrash harder. Instead, he focused eyes narrowing jaw set beneath his salt and pepper beard. Years of photographing migratory birds along riverbanks had given him strong instincts in unpredictable waters. This time, those instincts weren't for capturing an image, they were for saving a life. On the gravel shore, Emma ran parallel to the kayak, slipping over wet rocks and tangled roots. Her boots sank into the mud, but she didn't stop. Her breaths came in sharp bursts, but she barely felt her lungs. All she saw was Bailey, floundering in the current. Bailey vanished beneath the surface. Emma screamed, but just as quickly he resurfaced farther downstream, now dangerously close to a tangled mass of branches and driftwood lodged against a fallen tree. It formed what rescue workers called a strainer, a deadly trap that could catch even experienced swimmers. Liam saw it too late. "No," he muttered, driving his paddle deeper into the water. The current was too strong. Bailey was being pulled directly toward it. Suddenly, a large branch previously floating harmlessly nearby shifted in the current and wedged itself between Bailey and the pile of debris. The timing was uncanny, almost as if the river itself had intervened. Bailey bumped against the new barrier and clung to it instinctively with his paws, buying Liam just enough time. With a practiced motion, Liam leaned into the turn and extended his paddle. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. Bailey, to his amazement, responded. With a desperate lunge, the puppy grabbed the blade with his front paws. Liam guided him closer and with one arm hauled the soaked body into the kayak. Bailey collapsed instantly, shivering, his head pressed against Liam's chest. "Got you," Liam breathed. But the river wasn't done. A hydraulic wave surged toward them, fast and unpredictable. The kayak lifted, tilted. Liam wrapped both arms around Bailey and braced, curling forward as the boat bucked like a wild animal. Back on shore, Emma watched in horror as the kayak disappeared behind a spray of water. She ran faster, nearly tumbling, shouting his name. The kayak emerged, upright. Liam had rolled with the current perfectly. By the time he guided the boat to the riverbank, Emma was already waist-deep in the freezing water. Liam passed Bailey to her carefully. The puppy stirred slightly, let out a soft whimper, and then gave a faint wag of his tail. "He's alive," Emma sobbed, pulling him close. From the trail above, a voice called out, "Is someone hurt?" A woman in her early 50s, practical and wiry, was descending the hill. She wore a puffy blue vest over a forest ranger uniform and carried a walkie-talkie in one hand. This was Ranger Dana Ellsworth, the only full-time forest ranger in the Maple Hollow district. Known for her stern tone and sharp gaze, she was respected for her no-nonsense approach to rescue protocol and wildlife safety. Dana had once been a firefighter in Boston, but after losing her partner in a high-rise blaze, she relocated to Vermont seeking solitude and trees over sirens. "We're okay," Liam called back. "Puppy fell from the bridge. He's breathing, but he's freezing." Dana moved quickly, radioing for emergency support. "There's a warming station at the ranger shed. Less than 5 minutes." She eyed Bailey with unusual softness. "We'll get him there." They wrapped Bailey in Emma's coat and hurried toward the shed. Dana's weathered pickup truck waited near the trailhead. The interior smelled faintly of pine and antiseptic. Liam climbed into the back with Bailey still pressed to his chest while Emma rode shotgun. Dana drove with precision, her jaw set in silent determination. Inside the warming shed, a converted ranger outpost with a wood stove and a cot, Bailey was placed on a pile of thick blankets. Emma sat beside him, whispering to him, her fingers trembling as she stroked his damp fur. Liam stood quietly near the stove, warming his hands. Minutes later, a local vet arrived. Dr. Martha Blake, 47, was short, brisk, and always wore colorful rain boots no matter the weather. She had wide eyes behind thick glasses and a demeanor that mixed clinical sharpness with deep maternal instinct. Martha had once lost an entire litter during a flood in her first year of practice, and ever since she had never underestimated the fragility of life. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, already opening her kit. "Let me take a look at this brave little idiot." Bailey blinked, lifted his head, and let out a low groan. Martha ran her hands down his legs, checked his ribs, his eyes, his gums. No fractures, no internal bleeding. Pup's temperature is low, but rising. "Honestly, I'm stunned." She looked at Emma. "He should have broken something. Maybe everything. But he's just cold and scared." Emma buried her face in Bailey's neck. "You came back to me," she whispered. Martha smiled softly. "Sometimes they do." Bailey drifted into sleep, his breathing steady. Outside, the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the floor. Emma sat with her back against the wall, her eyes never leaving Bailey. Liam finally broke the silence. "You know," he said gently, "he shouldn't have survived that. Not the fall, not the current. Something helped him." Emma nodded slowly. "I know. I felt it too, like he wasn't alone down there." Neither of them said more. They didn't have to. Something had changed. The next morning dawned gray and pale, with a light mist hanging over Maple Hollow like breath on glass. From the window of Emma's small home, nestled near the edge of town, the world looked washed and fragile, still recovering from the chaos of the previous day. Bailey lay curled at the foot of her bed, warm under a flannel blanket, his breathing slow but steady. Emma hadn't slept much. She'd spent most of the night sitting beside him, afraid that if she closed her eyes she might wake to find the miracle undone. But Bailey had only stirred once, just before sunrise, and placed his paw gently over her hand as if to reassure her. When she finally stepped into the kitchen to make coffee, she noticed something strange. Bailey, despite having nearly drowned less than 24 hours ago, had quietly followed her. He sat in front of the back door, ears alert, tail thumping softly. Then, without a sound, he looked at the door, then back at her. Moments later, the doorbell rang. Emma froze the coffee mug in her hand, trembling slightly. No one had walked past the window, no car, no footsteps. But Bailey had known. When she opened the door, she found a delivery man holding a brown package. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Special delivery for a Miss Lawrence." She blinked. "I didn't order anything." The man shrugged. "From the Maple Hollow PTA. Said it was a thank you for your mural project." He left before she could say more. Inside the package was a handmade card signed by her students and a box of watercolor paints. Emma smiled, her fingers resting briefly on Bailey's head. He looked up at her, eyes soft, almost human. Later that morning, she bundled Bailey into a blanket-lined basket and carried him to her classroom. She wasn't planning to teach, just stop in to gather some things. But the moment she stepped inside, a hush fell over the room. A cluster of second graders were there with a substitute teacher. Miss Harper, a tall, soft-spoken woman in her late 20s with thick-rimmed glasses and hair tied in a long, efficient braid. She was new to town, having moved to Maple Hollow from Chicago after quitting a marketing job that had left her burnt out and anxious. Teaching had always been her childhood dream, and here, far from the buzz of city life, she was starting over. Among the students, one stood apart, Noah Benton, a quiet boy with wide brown eyes and a cowlick that refused to stay down. He was 8, thin as a reed, and hadn't spoken a word in over a year since losing his father in a sudden highway crash. He'd become a shadow in the classroom, always present but never quite there. When Bailey saw him, he whined softly. Emma set the basket down beside the art shelf, and Bailey, moving slower than usual, but with purpose, stepped out and padded toward Noah. The room went silent. Noah stared at the dog. Bailey stopped just in front of him, sat down, and tilted his head. Then, as if guided by instinct, he nudged Noah's hand with his nose. Noah didn't move at first. Then slowly his fingers curled. He reached out and placed his palm on Bailey's head. The class watched, breath held. Noah, Miss Harper whispered, half in disbelief. Noah's lips parted. He said nothing, but a single tear rolled down his cheek, and he crouched to wrap both arms around Bailey. The dog nuzzled in quietly, tail wagging. Emma felt the air shift. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper, something ancient. By lunchtime, word of the moment had spread. Teachers whispered in the halls. Students stared. Miss Harper approached Emma in the teacher's lounge, where Emma sat nursing lukewarm tea. "He's never done that before," the young teacher said, voice still trembling. "He wouldn't even look at therapy dogs last fall." "What's different about yours?" Emma didn't know how to answer. "He just knows things," she said quietly. Outside the window, the mist was beginning to clear. That evening after dinner, Emma sat on the couch, Bailey curled beside her. She reached for her sketchbook, intending to doodle, but instead found herself writing, not drawing, a journal entry. He knew the bell would ring. He knew Noah needed something more than silence. "He looks at me like he hears music I can't. Is this what healing looks like when it chooses to wear fur?" She closed the book and placed it on the coffee table. Bailey gave a soft sigh and laid his head in her lap. The next morning, a storm rolled in earlier than forecasted. Thunder boomed far off in the hills. The weatherman had called for sunny skies all week, but clouds black as coal settled above Maple Hollow like a warning. Bailey paced the floor half an hour before the storm began, not nervous, watchful. When the lightning came, Emma finally understood. He'd sensed it, again. Later that day, Martha called to check on him. He's not just lucky, Emma said over the phone. There's something else. Something tuned. Martha paused. You said he acted before the storm hit. Yes. Emma the vet said slowly, you might want to start keeping a record, just to see how often it happens. And Emma did. That night she opened a fresh notebook and wrote across the top the Bailey observations. She had no idea that this quiet little log would one day become the foundation for something much larger. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind that crept softly into the town with golden light seeping through budding maple branches and children's laughter echoing faintly from the park. Emma had spent most of the day grading student art projects and watching Bailey with new awareness. He had grown slightly since the fall, his once awkward gait had begun to find rhythm, and his golden coat now shimmered with a deeper hue. Yet his eyes, still warm and loyal, often fixed on places as if listening to things no one else could hear. Emma decided to take him for a quiet walk down by the southern bend of the Willow River, a part less frequented by tourists and joggers. That stretch was lined with tall reeds, and crooked cypress roots and birdsong filled the air like a hidden orchestra. She often went there when she needed silence that didn't feel empty. As they strolled the winding dirt path, Bailey walked just ahead, sniffing calmly. Occasionally he glanced back at Emma as if to make sure she was keeping up. She smiled softly at him, lost in thought. Then without warning, Bailey stopped. His body stiffened, ears pitched forward, nose quivering. A low whimper escaped him, followed by a sudden bolt through the grass toward the riverbank. Bailey. Emma called, quickening her steps. Bailey ran with purpose, weaving through the tall reeds until he reached a dense patch of underbrush at the edge of the water. By the time Emma caught up, he was pawing frantically at a soggy pile of driftwood tangled with plastic and leaves. His tail was rigid, and a sharp whine cut through the quiet. Emma dropped to her knees beside him. What is it? What did you find? Then she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound like a squeak. No, a mew. She held her breath and listened again. It was coming from under the debris. She began pulling at the branches with shaking hands, and beneath a crushed plastic bag soaked with river water, she uncovered 3 tiny kittens curled together in a wet heap. They were barely moving, their fur matted, their eyes sealed shut. Not more than a week old. Oh my God, Emma whispered, removing her jacket and wrapping it around the fragile bundle. The kittens made weak, rasping cries as she cradled them close. Bailey sat beside her now, calm but alert, watching her face for cues. At that moment, a voice called from the trail. Is everything all right down there? Emma looked up to see a man in a khaki windbreaker and glasses walking toward her. Tom Grayson, mid-40s, was a retired wildlife biologist who had returned to his hometown of Maple Hollow after years working for the National Park Service. Tall and lean, with deep crow's feet and a soft voice, Tom had the air of someone who'd spent his life listening more than talking. We're okay, Emma said, standing with the kittens wrapped close. But these little ones, they wouldn't have lasted another hour out here. Tom knelt to inspect them. Someone dumped them, he said, his jaw tightening. Probably thought the reeds would hide them. No way anyone would have found them here unless... He glanced at Bailey, then back at Emma. Unless someone knew exactly where to look. Emma said nothing. She didn't have to. Tom helped her get back to the trail. He had a small hatchback parked nearby and insisted on driving them to Dr. Martha Blake's clinic. During the ride, Bailey curled at Emma's feet, his body curled protectively toward the mewling bundle in her lap. At the clinic, Martha greeted them at the door, still wearing her polka-dot galoshes and a coffee stain on her lab coat. She took one look at the kittens and sighed. You always bring me the interesting cases, don't you? With practiced hands, she placed the kittens under a heat lamp and checked each one. They're hypothermic, severely dehydrated, but I think we caught them just in time. Tom hovered near the door, watching quietly. It's not luck, he muttered. It's something else. Martha raised an eyebrow. You mean Bailey? Tom nodded. He didn't just stumble across them. He found them, through all that brush and water and wind, he knew. Bailey stood quietly by the exam table, his eyes fixed on the kittens. One gave a faint squeak, and he wagged his tail once as if acknowledging their presence. Emma reached down and stroked his head. What did you hear out there, Bailey? What did you feel? That night, as the kittens slept in the incubator and Bailey dozed beside Emma's chair, Martha sat across from her legs, crossed notebook in hand. I've been thinking, the vet said. If you're serious about tracking his behavior, we should start gathering it systematically. Daily logs, controlled settings. Emma nodded slowly. You think it's real? I think it's more than real, Martha replied. I think it's replicable. And if it is, then what we're seeing, it could change how we think about animal cognition. Emma looked down at Bailey, who stirred at the sound of her voice. Or maybe she said, half smiling, he's just the only one listening. By Tuesday, the kittens had opened their eyes. Martha said it was a good sign, one more step toward survival. Bailey visited them daily, his snout gently pressed against the glass of their incubator, his body still whenever they stirred. He no longer barked or wagged. Instead, he watched with quiet intensity, like a sentry guarding a secret no one else could see. Emma had updated the Bailey observations every evening. She wrote down everything: his pacing before storms, his silence, when people arrived unexpectedly, the odd way he stared at certain places before anything happened. But what she hadn't expected was for him to act during something ordinary, something human. It started in the teacher's lounge at Maple Hollow Elementary. Emma was filling her thermos with stale coffee when Sarah Carver entered. Sarah was in her mid-50s, tall and elegantly built, with silver-streaked black hair and a wardrobe of pressed slacks and soft cardigans that made her look like she'd stepped out of a gardening magazine. She taught 5th grade and had been at the school for over 20 years. Always kind, always organized. The type of woman who brought muffins without being asked and remembered everyone's birthday. But something had changed in Sarah over the last few months. She'd become quieter. Her laugh, once bright and sharp, now ended too soon. Her eyes seemed a little more hollow, and more than once Emma had caught her staring off into nothing, her knuckles white around a coffee cup. On this particular morning, Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the sugar jar. Bailey, who had been curled beside Emma's feet, lifted his head abruptly. He stood. He stared at Sarah. His tail didn't wag. Instead, he walked slowly to her, placing himself between her and the counter. Then with a low whimper, he pressed his nose into her abdomen. Sarah froze. "Oh, hello there, Bailey." She smiled faintly, but her hand didn't reach to pet him. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" Bailey didn't move. He whined again. Then he pawed at her leg. Emma stood instantly alert. "I've never seen him do that before." Sarah gave a thin laugh. "Dogs always love me. I used to have a retriever just like him." She stepped away from the counter and tried to leave the room, but Bailey followed, blocking her path. Emma called him back. He didn't obey. The silence that fell in the room was uncomfortable, stretched tight. Later that afternoon, Emma found Sarah alone in the courtyard, sitting on a bench under the sycamore tree. Bailey was still by her side, lying down now, but watching her intently. "I'm sorry," Emma said gently. "He's usually well behaved. He must have picked up on something." Sarah looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "It's not your fault." Then her voice dropped, barely audible. "I've been having stomach pain for a while now. It comes and goes. I was supposed to go in last week for a scan, but I canceled. I told myself it was probably just stress." Emma felt the air go still. "I think your dog knows something I've been trying not to." She went for the scan 2 days later. It was an early-stage gastrointestinal tumor, treatable, caught just in time. Sarah called Emma that night, her voice cracking on the line. "I owe him everything," she whispered. "I don't know what made him notice, but he did, before even I was ready to see it." Emma wrote the entire incident in the observation journal, underlined the words "first human diagnosis." But Bailey's behavior didn't stop there. That weekend, Emma took him to the town's open-air market. It was a small, cheerful sprawl of stalls and folding tables lined with baked goods, second-hand books, and homemade soaps. The sky was bright, and the air smelled of cinnamon rolls and sun-warmed apples. Bailey walked calmly by her side until they passed a table where an elderly man was selling honey in glass jars shaped like bears. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and suspenders with a long white beard that made him look like someone carved out of folklore. His name tag read, "Walter Dean, age 78. Bailey suddenly stopped, sniffed the air, then whimpered. He backed away from Walter's table, tugging on the leash, then circled behind Emma and pushed his nose against her thigh, a signal he'd used before when something was off. Emma paused. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" Walter chuckled. "Fit as an old fiddle," he said. "Why do you ask?" Bailey barked once. Loud. Not aggressive, but clear. Emma hesitated. "Maybe you should get your blood pressure checked." Walter, amused, agreed, mostly to prove her wrong. On Monday, Emma got a voicemail. It was Walter. "You were right. Stroke risk. Doctor said I was a walking time bomb. Your dog's got the nose of a prophet." That night, Emma sat on her porch with Bailey beside her. The wind rustled through the pine trees. She looked down at him and whispered, "What are you becoming?" Bailey just leaned his head against her knee, not demanding, just listening. Saturday morning arrived with a hush over Maple Hollow. The wind had changed direction during the night, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and pine sap. Clouds thick and unusually low hovered over the hills like a second sky waiting to fall. Emma stepped out onto the porch in her flannel robe, a steaming mug of tea in one hand, and found Bailey already there, sitting perfectly still, ears alert, eyes trained not on the horizon but slightly to the west. She followed his gaze. There was nothing unusual, just the ridge where the forest began, the trailhead that led into the old logging paths. But Bailey didn't look away. Emma placed her hand on his head. His fur was warm, his body calm, but something in him was vibrating like a silent wire pulled taut. By noon, the town was buzzing with concern. A teenage girl named Kayla Mercer had been reported missing. 16 years old, Kayla was known for her adventurous streak and love of photography. She had short curly hair dyed bright magenta, a lean frame always wrapped in oversized sweaters, and a habit of disappearing into the woods for inspiration. She lived with her grandmother, Marjorie Mercer, a widow who had raised her alone after the girl's mother passed away from an overdose. Marjorie, a woman in her 70s with sun-leathered skin and the grit of someone who'd worked 3 jobs most of her life, was known to the town as tough but loving. When she called the sheriff that morning, her voice cracked for the first time anyone could remember. She took her camera and never came back, she told the deputies. That's not like her. She always checks in. By the time Emma heard the news, a volunteer search party had already begun to organize. Bailey had paced the house since dawn, tail low energy focused like a compass with one true direction. Emma didn't wait for instructions. She clipped on his leash, grabbed her boots, and headed straight for the community center where the volunteers were gathering. Outside the building, folding tables had been set up. Maps were spread across them. Coffee and thermoses steamed beside boxes of granola bars. Emma approached Sheriff Paul Randall, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with deep-set eyes and a calm voice that could settle a room. A former military medic, he had a quiet authority about him, steadfast and unflinching. "Emma," he said with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you here." She gestured to Bailey. "I think he wants to help." The sheriff studied the dog for a long moment. "He's the one that found those kittens, right, and sensed Sarah Carver's tumor." "And Walter Dean's stroke," Emma added. Paul glanced toward the trailhead. "We've already covered some of the western path. Nothing so far." "Bailey's been pulling toward the northwest ridge all morning," she said. Paul hesitated, then nodded. "Can't hurt to follow his lead." He assigned Deputy Lana Ruiz to accompany them. Lana was in her early 30s, athletic and sharp, with dark brown eyes and hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail. She had grown up in nearby Bennington and joined the force 3 years ago after leaving behind a career in corporate security, disillusioned by bureaucracy and seeking something more real. Together, the 3 of them and Bailey set off into the woods. The air was thick with anticipation, the forest quiet except for the soft crunch of leaves beneath their boots. Bailey led with absolute focus. He pulled gently, not frantically, guiding them off the main trail and down a slope tangled with ferns and fallen logs. Emma trusted his movements completely, now never questioning when he paused to sniff the wind or change direction. Half a mile in, Bailey stopped. His nose quivered. Then he bolted forward off the path entirely. "Bailey!" Emma shouted, but he was already gone. Lana reacted first. "This way." They followed him through thick brush branches, clawing at their coats. After several hundred feet, they broke into a small clearing, and there she was. Kayla lay at the base of a shallow ravine, half covered by pine needles, her ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. Her camera bag lay beside her, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. She blinked up at them, her voice hoarse. "I tried yelling," she whispered. No one heard me. Bailey approached her slowly, then lay beside her, placing his head across her chest. "He found me," Kayla said. "I heard him before I saw him. I thought I imagined it." Emma knelt beside her, eyes brimming with tears. Lana radioed for medics. Within 30 minutes, a stretcher team had arrived and Kayla was airlifted to the nearest hospital. Her injuries were minor dehydration, a broken ankle, and a mild concussion. But the doctor later said if she had spent another night out there, hypothermia would have set in. Sheriff Randall pulled Emma aside that evening. "I've seen bloodhounds work entire shifts without results," he said, "and your retriever just walked straight to her like he had a GPS built into his soul." Emma didn't know what to say. Bailey was lying at her feet, licking his paw quietly. "She said she imagined a dog coming," Randall added, "before he arrived." Emma's heart skipped. She said it felt like she was calling to something, not with her voice but in her head. Emma crouched beside Bailey and stroked his ears. "You're not just hearing the world, are you?" she whispered. "You're hearing us." The sky was clear and cool on Sunday morning, the kind of crisp air that made the trees sway, like they were exhaling after holding their breath all week. Emma sat on the porch steps with Bailey lying next to her, his head resting on her foot. Since Kayla's rescue, Bailey had been quieter, thoughtful, almost reserved. Not tired, but changed. There was a weight in his gaze now, as though he had begun to carry not only instincts but choices. Emma had spoken to Sheriff Randall again the night before. He confirmed what Kayla had said during her hospital stay. She had imagined a dog finding her, not a generic one, but a golden retriever. She claimed she'd sent out a call with her mind, not expecting it to work. This morning, Bailey had gotten up before sunrise and sat by the door, staring east toward the middle school's old greenhouse. Emma had dismissed it. At first, he often stared at odd things, but he didn't move for over an hour, so she followed. The greenhouse, long since closed for repairs, had become a sort of unofficial hangout spot for students who didn't quite fit in. As Emma approached with Bailey trotting beside her, she noticed the faint sound of piano chords leaking through the cracked door. Inside sat Oliver Dunn, a 13-year-old boy with a shock of curly blonde hair and limbs still too long for his frame. He wore a rumpled hoodie and oversized glasses constantly sliding down his nose. A musical prodigy, Oliver had a gift for composing, but he was also nonverbal. Diagnosed with selective mutism and social anxiety at an early age, he communicated mostly through music and eye contact. He didn't flinch when Bailey entered. Instead, he kept playing a slow, haunting melody that hung in the air like a breath being held. Bailey walked over, sat directly beside the bench, and rested his chin on Oliver's knee. Oliver stopped. He stared at Bailey for a long time, his fingers frozen above the keys. Then, with a sudden and strange calm, he placed his left hand gently on Bailey's head. And then something extraordinary happened. Emma, standing in the doorway, blinked. Her chest tightened. The air seemed to grow denser, warmer. For a brief second, no more than a breath, she felt as though she were not looking at Oliver from the outside, but from within. The cluttered thoughts of a teenage mind, images, sounds, half-sentences rushed over her like a wave and then vanished just as quickly. Oliver exhaled sharply. His hand dropped. Bailey stood up, moved over to Emma, and touched her hand with his nose. Emma knelt beside him. "What was that?" Oliver looked up. He didn't speak, but his eyes were clear, focused. And then, in the softest voice, cracked and unused, he whispered, "He let you feel what I feel." Emma's breath caught. "Oliver?" He nodded once, just for a second. That afternoon, Emma brought Oliver to Dr. Martha Blake's clinic under the pretense of checking in on the kittens. She needed someone else, someone objective, to witness what was happening. Martha watched with clinical skepticism as Bailey walked over to Oliver again and placed a paw on the boy's shoulder. This time the room fell into a strange stillness. Martha blinked. "It's warm. I can feel something pressing in behind my eyes." Emma whispered, "Describe it." Martha closed her eyes. "It's like feeling grief from someone else's chest. But not mine. There's music, and a field, and green paint. I don't understand." Oliver simply smiled. Afterward, Martha pulled Emma aside. "We're not just talking about intuition anymore. This is sensory transfer, emotional overlay. Whatever this is, it goes beyond anything I've seen." Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed, the observation journal open beside her, flipping through the pages. Notes, timestamps, weather conditions, physical behaviors, it all now seemed like prelude to something larger. Bailey wasn't just sensing, he was bridging. The next morning, Oliver's mother came by to speak with Emma. Janelle Dunn, mid-30s, had the exhausted beauty of someone who had spent her life in worry. Short with tightly braided hair and dark eyes, always scanning, she was fiercely protective of her son. She wore a faded denim jacket and clutched a thermos like it was armor. "I don't know what happened yesterday," she said cautiously, "but Oliver has been humming. out loud. He hasn't done that since he was 8. Emma offered tea, and they sat on the porch while Bailey lay between them. Janelle stared at the dog. You think he's doing this on purpose? I don't think he's doing it at all, Emma said. I think he's allowing it. The conversation drifted into silence. Then Janelle added, Oliver told me last night that Bailey hears the quiet things inside people. Emma nodded. That sounds about right. They sat in silence a while longer, then Janelle leaned down and ran a hand through Bailey's fur. Thank you, she whispered. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Bailey stood at the edge of the yard, his body still, his ears tuned to something far beyond human sound. Emma joined him, watching the sky turn purple above Maple Hollow. She didn't ask what he was listening for, because she already knew. The morning was unusually still. No breeze, no bird song, just a hush that settled over Maple Hollow like a held breath. Emma stood at the edge of her driveway watching Bailey. He wasn't pacing or whining like in the past. He was simply staring not at the woods, not at the house, but toward Cedar Bridge, the place where it had all begun. She didn't need to ask. She knew. By now, Emma had stopped questioning Bailey's silent summons. He was more than a companion, more than a dog with a gift. He had become a thread connecting people, emotions, unspoken truths, and now it seemed the very beginning of his journey was calling him back. She clipped on his leash, though she already knew it wouldn't be used. Bailey would lead. They walked through town, passing the shops and sidewalks where folks now stopped to wave their eyes, softening at the sight of him. Word had spread about the rescues, the predictions, even the strange, beautiful moment with Oliver. No one could explain it, but no one wanted to. Some mysteries were meant to be held, not solved. As they reached the foot of Cedar Bridge, Emma slowed. The wood had been repaired, but the scars of the fall remained in her memory. It was quiet here, always was, but today it felt sacred. Bailey walked steadily across the planks, pausing only when he reached the center. He turned once to look at her, his eyes steady, then sat down and faced the river below. Emma approached slowly. She stood beside him, hands resting on the railing, looking down at the same spot where she had once screamed his name, convinced she'd lost him forever. But he hadn't been lost. He had returned with something more. For a long time, they stood like that. Then Bailey did something he'd never done before. He rose, turned toward Emma, and placed his paw gently, deliberately against her chest, just over her heart. Emma felt it instantly, a wave of sensation like warm water rushing through her. The world shimmered around her. Her breath caught as the air bent, shifted, and for a brief moment she could see everything. She saw the flow of the river, not just its surface, but the push of water beneath the ancient current that remembered every footstep, every fall, every stone. She saw the trees breathing slow and alive, their roots connected deep beneath the town. She saw faces, Sarah, Noah, Kayla, Oliver, each lit by something invisible yet real. The echoes of grief and healing, of questions and quiet answers moving through them like light through glass. And she saw herself, fragile and whole at once, grieving still but not broken. Not anymore. The moment lasted only seconds. But when it passed, Emma staggered, slightly gasping. Bailey stepped back, watching her. I felt it, she whispered. Everything. Behind them, footsteps approached. It was Liam Harper. He wore his camera bag slung across his shoulder, his expression half wary, half curious. I had a feeling I'd find you here, he said, his voice low. I was walking by the river and, I don't know, something pulled me. He stopped short when he saw Emma's face. What happened, Emma didn't answer with words. She simply looked at Bailey, then back at Liam. And as if sensing what she meant, Bailey crossed the bridge, sat at Liam's feet, and placed his paw over Liam's hand. Liam blinked. His eyes widened. Then slowly he exhaled. I can feel it. Not thoughts, not voices, but something old. Emma nodded. It's like being invited into something we forgot we used to belong to. That evening, the town gathered on the grassy banks near the bridge. Not for an official ceremony, not even because anyone planned it. People simply came. Sheriff Randall brought lanterns. Sarah Carver brought warm bread. Oliver and his mother sat quietly on a quilt, and the kittens, now healthy, playful, and adopted by 3 different families, tumbled in a crate nearby. At the center of it all, Bailey sat calmly like a sentinel who had fulfilled his task. Emma stood beside him, her heart full but unburdened. Someone asked what he was. Another miracle. A medical marvel? Emma shook her head. No, he's not magic. He's just awake. And now so are we. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They come wrapped in golden fur with quiet eyes and a listening heart. Bailey didn't speak, didn't heal with his paws, and yet he brought light into the darkest corners of people's lives. Through pain, fear, silence, and loss, he reminded a small town, and maybe all of us, that God still works through the most unexpected vessels. This story is more than about a dog. It's about what happens when we slow down long enough to hear the quiet things inside us. It's about being open to the unexplainable, the divine nudges, the moments that cannot be reasoned but can be deeply felt. In your own life, maybe the miracle isn't a dog who saves lives. Maybe it's a kind word when you needed it most. A stranger who showed up at just the right time. A tug in your heart you couldn't explain. That too could be God. That too could be grace in motion. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes or needs to believe in miracles. Comment below and type Amen if you believe God still works through love, through animals, and through quiet acts of compassion. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel for more real stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the goodness still alive in this world. May God bless you wherever you are, and may He send light to you just as He sent Bailey.